At 4:32 on the morning of September 9, 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill crouched in the pre-dawn darkness on a hillside above Salerno, Italy, his longbow drawn tight while German machine gunners fortified their positions less than 60 yards ahead. The Allied invasion fleet lay behind him in the bay, and ahead the enemy waited with steel and fire. If you're fascinated by the most unconventional warriors of World War II, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story will challenge everything you think you know about modern warfare. John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill was born in Hong Kong on September 16, 1906, into a family with deep colonial and military roots. His father served in the Ceylon civil service, and young Jack grew up surrounded by tales of empire, adventure, and combat from another age. He attended King William's College on the Isle of Man, then the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, graduating in 1926 as a second lieutenant in the Manchester Regiment. But the peacetime army of the late 1920s offered little adventure for a young man who had grown up dreaming of heroic deeds and hand-to-hand combat. By 1936, restless and unfulfilled, Churchill resigned his commission. He drifted through various pursuits, working as a newspaper editor in Nairobi, modeling for romance novel covers, even appearing as an extra in the 1938 film The Thief of Baghdad. But his most unusual passion was archery. Churchill practiced obsessively with a longbow, the weapon of medieval English archers at Agincourt and Crécy. He became skilled enough to represent Great Britain in the World Archery Championships in Oslo in 1939, just months before the world descended into war once again. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Churchill immediately rejoined the army. At 33, he was older than most junior officers, but he brought something rare, an almost anachronistic warrior spirit that seemed to belong to another century entirely. Posted to France with the British Expeditionary Force, Churchill distinguished himself not through conventional means, but through sheer audacity and strangeness. He reportedly achieved the only confirmed kill with a longbow during the entire war, when he shot a German soldier during an ambush near L'Épinette in May 1940. The arrow struck silently, and the enemy patrol never knew what had killed their comrade until Churchill and his men were already gone. The evacuation from Dunkirk might have broken lesser men, but Churchill returned to England with his longbow intact and his conviction stronger than ever. He volunteered for the newly formed Commandos, elite units trained for raiding operations, sabotage, and close-quarters combat. Here finally was a place where his eccentricities might be assets rather than liabilities. He was assigned to No. 3 Commando and quickly earned the nickname Mad Jack, though those who served under him soon learned there was method in his madness. On December 27, 1941, Churchill participated in Operation Archery, a commando raid on German positions in Vågsøy, Norway. The operation aimed to destroy fish oil factories that supplied glycerin for German explosives, eliminate garrison troops, and capture prisoners for intelligence purposes. As the landing craft approached the rocky Norwegian coast through freezing darkness, Churchill stood at the prow, his longbow strung and ready, his broadsword claymore strapped to his waist. His men thought him insane. Officers in other units whispered that he would get good men killed with his theatrics. The landing craft grounded on the icy shore at 8:48 a.m. German sentries spotted them immediately, raising the alarm. Churchill leaped from the boat, sprinting across exposed ground as machine gun fire tore through the air around him. His men followed, expecting their commanding officer to take cover and direct fire. Instead, Churchill dropped to one knee, drew his longbow, and sent an arrow whistling through the morning air. It struck a German sentry in the chest, dropping him instantly and silently. Before the other sentries could react, Churchill's men were on them with rifles and grenades. The psychological impact of that silent death was profound. German soldiers who witnessed it later described the terror of seeing their comrade fall without warning, without sound, killed by a weapon they associated with medieval warfare, not the 20th century. It created a moment of confusion and fear that Churchill exploited ruthlessly. His men stormed the German positions while the enemy was still processing what they had seen. By the time the raid concluded hours later, the commandos had destroyed their objectives, killed over 150 German soldiers, and captured 98 prisoners. Churchill himself had led multiple charges, wielding his claymore in close-quarters combat, his war cry echoing across the snowy landscape. His superiors didn't know what to make of him. The raid was a tactical success, but Churchill's methods seemed to belong to another era entirely. Yet the results spoke for themselves. His unit suffered minimal casualties while achieving all objectives. The German prisoners, when interrogated, spoke with genuine fear about the British officer with the sword and bow, describing him in terms usually reserved for myths or nightmares. Churchill's reputation grew. He insisted on going into battle with his longbow, his claymore, and his bagpipes. Yes, bagpipes, which he played to boost morale and unnerve the enemy. He held the belief that any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. A statement that seemed absurd in an age of tanks and artillery, but that Churchill backed up with consistent, lethal effectiveness. His men initially mocked him behind his back. Within months, they would have followed him anywhere. In July 1943, Churchill participated in the Allied invasion of Sicily as part of Operation Husky. His unit landed on the southern coast amid fierce German resistance. While other officers coordinated fire support and called in artillery, Churchill led from the front with his medieval arsenal. During one engagement near the town of Piglione, German troops had established a strong point in a stone farmhouse, pinning down an entire British company with machine gun fire. Artillery was called in but failed to dislodge the defenders. Churchill studied the position, then turned to his second-in-command. "I'm going to take it," he said simply. "Sir, that's suicide. We need armor support or—" Churchill was already moving. He crept through an olive grove in the pre-dawn darkness, his longbow in hand, moving with patience that seemed impossible for a man of his aggressive nature. He positioned himself 30 yards from the farmhouse, invisible in the shadows. When dawn broke and German soldiers emerged to relieve the night watch, Churchill's arrows began flying. One sentry fell, then another, then a third. The Germans never heard the shots because there were no shots. They fired wildly into the trees, convinced they were under sniper attack, wasting ammunition on ghosts. When chaos peaked, Churchill charged the building with his claymore drawn and his bagpipes wailing. The psychological shock was total. German soldiers, already unnerved by the silent deaths of their comrades, now faced a screaming British officer wielding a sword and producing unholy sounds from an instrument they didn't recognize. Several surrendered immediately. Others fled. Churchill captured the position with minimal British casualties, taking 42 German soldiers prisoner, a feat he accomplished essentially alone, armed with weapons that most military historians would have declared obsolete centuries earlier. But it was at Salerno, during the Allied invasion of mainland Italy in September 1943, that Churchill's unconventional methods proved most valuable. The Allies landed at Salerno on September 9th, hoping to establish a beachhead for the advance toward Naples and Rome. The Germans, under Field Marshal Kesselring, had anticipated the landing and prepared extensive defenses. The battle that followed was among the bloodiest of the Italian campaign, with Allied forces very nearly thrown back into the sea. Churchill's No. 2 Commando was tasked with capturing and holding a series of hills overlooking the beachhead, positions vital for artillery spotters and defensive lines. The Germans understood the tactical importance of these hills as well as the Allies did, and they fought savagely to hold them. Churchill led his men up the steep, rocky slopes under heavy fire, moving through terrain that made conventional tactics nearly useless. Here, in the close confines of mountain warfare, his bow once again proved its worth. German sentries positioned on rocky outcroppings couldn't be engaged with rifles without revealing Allied positions and drawing devastating return fire. Churchill's arrows allowed him to eliminate these sentries silently, one by one, creating gaps in the German defensive line. His men followed, moving through the breaches Churchill created, taking positions that should have been impossible to capture. At one point, Churchill's unit was pinned down in a ravine by German machine gun nests on both flanks. Artillery couldn't touch the nests without hitting Allied positions. Churchill studied the terrain, then gestured to his radio man. "Tell headquarters we're going silent for 30 minutes. No fire support." "Sir, just do it." What followed was a masterclass in infiltration tactics. Churchill moved through the rocks with 6 picked men, approaching one machine gun nest from an angle the Germans had assumed was impossible to traverse. He killed the first sentry with an arrow, then rushed the position with his claymore before the other gunners could react. The Germans, shocked by the sudden close-quarters assault, surrendered. Churchill repeated the process with the second nest. Within 20 minutes, both positions were captured, and his pinned-down unit was able to advance. But the fighting at Salerno was brutal and relentless, and not even Churchill's audacity could change the fundamental mathematics of modern warfare. On the night of September 14th, German forces launched a massive counterattack, attempting to split the Allied beachhead and destroy the invasion force. Churchill's unit, holding an exposed position on the hills, found itself surrounded. He organized a fighting retreat, using every trick he had learned: ambushes, silent kills, psychological warfare, to slow the German advance. At one point, he and a small group of men became separated from the main force, cut off behind German lines. For 3 days, Churchill and his men evaded capture, moving through enemy-controlled territory, surviving on scavenged rations and what they could steal from German supply dumps. Churchill later described those days as among the most terrifying of his life. The arrogance, the theatricality, the bagpipes and swords. None of it mattered when he was hunted through unfamiliar mountains by an enemy that outnumbered him 100 to 1. He thought about his wife, Rosamund, whom he had married in 1941, and the son he had barely seen. He thought about all the men who had died under his command, men who had trusted his judgment, even when his methods seemed insane. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on him during those cold nights in Italian caves, listening for German patrols. On September 17th, Churchill and his surviving men finally fought their way back to Allied lines. He was exhausted, filthy, and haunted by the faces of the men who hadn't made it. But the Salerno beachhead had held, largely because units like Churchill's had bought precious time with their blood and determination. The Allies would advance northward from Salerno, though the Italian campaign would prove to be a grinding, costly affair that lasted until the very end of the war. Churchill was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of a battalion. He continued to carry his longbow and claymore, continued to play his bagpipes going into battle, continued to lead from the front in ways that terrified his superiors and inspired his men. In 1944, he was sent to Yugoslavia to coordinate with Tito's partisans, fighting against German occupation forces in the mountains and forests of the Balkans. Here again, his unconventional methods proved valuable. Partisan warfare favored audacity, surprise, and personal courage, all qualities Churchill possessed in abundance. But in May 1944, his luck ran out. During a raid on the island of Brač, Churchill's unit was ambushed by a much larger German force. He fought with characteristic ferocity, his claymore red with blood, his voice hoarse from shouting orders and war cries. But there were too many Germans, and one by one, his men fell around him. When his ammunition was exhausted and his sword finally knocked from his hand, Churchill was captured. The Germans, recognizing him from intelligence reports about the mad British officer with the bow and sword, treated him with a mixture of respect and bewilderment. He was interrogated repeatedly. German intelligence officers couldn't believe that a man of his rank would engage in such theatrical combat methods. They suspected he was attempting to draw attention away from more important operations, or that the reports of his archery kills were Allied propaganda. Churchill confirmed everything, speaking frankly about his methods and his beliefs. War, he told them, had become too impersonal, too distant. Men killed each other from miles away, never seeing their enemies' faces, never testing their courage in direct combat. He believed this made war easier, more palatable, and therefore more likely. The German officers listened with fascination and discomfort, unsure whether they were interrogating a warrior or a madman. Churchill was sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, a place of horror and death where thousands of prisoners were worked to death or executed. The camp was primarily for political prisoners, and Allied officers considered high risk for escape attempts. Churchill was definitely high risk. In September 1944, he escaped by crawling under the fence during an air raid blackout and walking through occupied Germany toward the Baltic coast. He was recaptured within days but had covered over 20 miles on foot through enemy territory, moving at night and hiding during the day, surviving on stolen vegetables and water from streams. He was transferred to Tyrol in Austria, to a prisoner of war camp for high-value captives. In April 1945, as the war entered its final weeks and the Third Reich collapsed, Churchill escaped again, this time successfully. He and several other officers walked over 150 miles through the Alps, navigating by stars, avoiding German patrols and desperate SS units that were executing prisoners rather than letting them be liberated. On May 4, 1945, just days before Germany's surrender, Churchill and his companions encountered American forces advancing through Austria. After months of captivity, starvation rations, and the constant fear of execution, Jack Churchill was finally free. But the war in Europe was over, and Churchill arrived too late to participate in its final battles. He later said with characteristic dark humor, "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years. It was a joke." But it revealed something about Churchill's relationship with combat. He had found purpose and meaning in war, a sense of direct action and immediate consequence that civilian life could never match. The end of the war meant the end of the only life where his peculiar skills and temperament had made sense. Churchill was transferred to Burma in August 1945, hoping to fight against the Japanese. He arrived just as atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the Pacific War before he could see action. He later remarked that he was disappointed, a statement that horrified some but that made perfect sense to anyone who understood what war had been for him. Not politics or ideology, but personal combat, the testing of individual courage and skill against an enemy who could kill you just as easily as you could kill them. After the war, Churchill remained in the army for several years, serving in Palestine during the difficult period before Israeli independence, then as an instructor at Land Air Warfare School in Australia. He took up surfing, becoming one of the first British surfers, riding waves with the same fearless abandon he had brought to combat. He qualified as a parachutist at age 43, an age when most officers were content behind desks. He designed and patented a new type of archery quiver. He rode a motorcycle across Europe. He could not sit still, could not accept comfortable mediocrity, could not forget the intensity and clarity of combat. He retired from the Army in 1959 with the rank of lieutenant colonel and a chest full of medals, including the Distinguished Service Order and Bar. He settled in Surrey with his wife and their 2 sons, trying to adapt to civilian life. By all accounts, he struggled. Friends and family described him as restless, haunted by memories of the war, unable to find the same sense of purpose in peacetime pursuits. He took up hobbies obsessively, building elaborate model railways, restoring steam engines, mastering various musical instruments beyond the bagpipes, always searching for something that would fill the void left by combat's absence. He rarely spoke about his experiences during the war, at least not the darker aspects. He would tell amusing anecdotes about playing bagpipes in battle or capturing prisoners with his sword. Stories that made him seem like a colorful eccentric rather than a man who had killed dozens of enemy soldiers in close combat, who had watched friends die, who had survived captivity in Nazi camps and multiple escape attempts that should have ended in his execution. The humor and theatricality were armor, a way of processing trauma without ever truly confronting it. In his later years, Churchill's story became something of a legend in military circles, though it remained relatively unknown to the general public. Younger soldiers heard tales about Mad Jack and assumed they were exaggerated or invented, the sort of myths that wars always generate. Even the documented facts of his service seemed too bizarre to be true. The longbow kills, the sword charges, the capture of 42 prisoners essentially single-handed, the escapes from Nazi captivity. But every detail was verified in official records, confirmed by witnesses, documented in after-action reports that read like historical fiction, but were simply accurate accounts of a man who refused to fight the 20th century's war with anything resembling conformity. Jack Churchill died on March 8, 1996, at the age of 89. His death received modest attention in British newspapers. Obituaries that focused on his eccentricities and colorful personality, while often glossing over the deeper implications of his story. He was remembered as a character, an amusing footnote in the history of World War II, the man who brought a sword and bow to a modern war. But this missed the point entirely. Churchill wasn't simply eccentric or theatrical. He represented something profound about the nature of warfare and human courage. In the most industrialized, mechanized, impersonal war in human history, a war of aerial bombardment, mass artillery, and mechanized armor, one man proved that individual skill, audacity, and courage could still make a decisive difference. He demonstrated that the human factor, the quality of individual warriors, had not been rendered obsolete by technology. His success wasn't despite his archaic weapons, but because of how he employed them, silently, psychologically, in ways that created confusion and fear disproportionate to their physical lethality. More than that, Churchill forced everyone around him to confront uncomfortable questions about modern warfare. His fellow officers were disturbed by his methods not because they didn't work, but because they did work, and that success challenged the comfortable narrative that war had become clean, distant, and professional. Churchill's arrows, his sword charges, his face-to-face combat made war personal again, made it immediate and visceral in ways that artillery strikes and aerial bombing never could. He reminded everyone that war, ultimately, is not about machines or technology, but about human beings making the choice to kill other human beings. His medieval weapons stripped away the comfortable distance that modern warfare provided. But Churchill's story also reveals the cost of such choices. The man who played bagpipes going into battle, who charged machine gun nests with a sword, who joked about extending the war, that same man spent his later years restless and haunted, unable to find peace in the world he had helped preserve. The warrior spirit that made him effective in combat made him ill-suited for peace. The intensity and clarity of battle, where life and death were decided in seconds and courage was tested moment by moment, left peacetime existence feeling empty and meaningless by comparison. This is the tragedy, hidden beneath the amusing anecdotes and colorful legends. History remembers millions of names from World War II, or more accurately, history reduces millions of individuals to statistics, to casualty figures and division strengths, to dots on maps and lines in logbooks. Behind each number was a person with fears and hopes, with families and dreams, with the capacity for courage and terror. Most of them are forgotten, their stories lost, their experiences reduced to data points in academic studies of tactics and strategy. Jack Churchill avoided that anonymity through sheer force of personality and unconventional methods. But his story reminds us that countless others, just as brave and just as worthy of remembrance, have been forgotten simply because their courage was expressed in more conventional ways. The bow and sword made Churchill memorable, but what truly defined him was something deeper: the willingness to face death directly, to lead from the front, to refuse the comfortable distance that modern warfare offered. That quality existed in thousands of soldiers who fought with rifles instead of bows, who led charges without bagpipes, who showed the same courage without the theatrical flair. Churchill's story honors them too in a way, by reminding us that behind every military action, every tactical success or failure, were individual human beings making choices under impossible pressure, carrying burdens that would mark them for life. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe for more forgotten heroes of World War II, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if someone in your family served, their stories deserve to be remembered too, whether they carried medieval weapons or modern rifles, whether they became legends or remained anonymous. Every one of them faced the same fundamental test of courage, and every one of them deserves more than becoming a forgotten number in history's ledger.